The iron lock on the Vance estate gate clicked open with a sound like breaking bone. And Elowen could no longer call this place home. She stood in the rain-slicked courtyard, her arms wrapped around Ghost's trembling body. The white Maltese puppy pressed against the thin cotton of her day dress, no longer fine enough to be called a lady's gown. At 19, she had become what the bailiff's records now declared her: a debt. Took everything down to the girl's pet, Mr. Howell had sneered at the auction clerk that morning, loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear. £50 for the beast. That's what the interest comes to. Soft-hearted fool, another man had muttered, shaking his head at Elowen. Should have sold it weeks ago. Now she'll lose it anyway and be left with nothing. Elowen's hands had tightened in Ghost's fur then, but she'd kept her tears silent, the way her mother had begged her to before they'd taken the furniture from her sick room. Her father had made his choices. He wasn't here now. No. He'd never be here again. She was alone. The lead bailiff cleared his throat, his voice flat as a signed warrant. "Bring the dog forward, Miss Vance." The crowd of neighbors and scavengers, Thornhill's hungriest vultures, their faces half hidden beneath umbrellas and judgment, stepped back to form a corridor. Through the drumming rain and morning fog, Elowen heard it. The deep rumble of hooves, then the sharp crack of carriage wheels on stone. A black carriage was approaching, unmarked, moving with the certainty of someone who did not ask permission. The Duke of Oakhaven had come to collect what he'd bought. But the bailiff's hand was already reaching for Ghost. Elowen stumbled backward, her boots sliding in the mud that had once been her mother's rose garden. The puppy yelped, a small, pitiful sound that cut through the murmur of the crowd like a child's cry. "Please," Elowen whispered, hating the break in her voice. "He's only 8 weeks old. He's frightened. He's collateral." The bailiff's fingers closed around Ghost's scruff, and the puppy twisted, nipping at the air in panic. "Lord Vane's interest ain't paid in sentiment, girl." "My lovely family, before we continue with Elowen's story, I would like to ask for a favor from you. Like this story, share it, and tell me in the comments section where you are watching from. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel, hit that subscribe button now so you do not miss beautiful stories like this. Now, let us continue with the story." The crowd pressed closer now, a semicircle of hungry eyes and rain-soaked wool. Mrs. Caldwell from the milliner's shop stood with her arms crossed, lips pursed in satisfaction. Young Thomas Hewitt, who'd once asked Elowen to dance at the Harvest Festival, wouldn't meet her gaze. They'd all come to watch the Vance name finally drown. £50, the bailiff announced, lifting Ghost by the scruff as the puppy whimpered and scrambled at empty air. "Do I hear 50 for the purebred Maltese? Rare stock, this. Came all the way from the continent before the family went to ruin." Elowen lunged forward, but another bailiff caught her arm, his grip iron hard above her elbow. "Stay back, miss. You've no right to interfere with the settlement." "He's mine." The words tore from her throat, raw and desperate. "You've taken the house, the land, my mother's jewelry, everything. Please, not Ghost, not him." The bailiff holding her arm leaned close, his breath sour with tobacco. "Should have thought of that before your father gambled away 3 estates and a merchant ship, shouldn't you?" Laughter rippled through the crowd, soft and cruel. Elowen felt it like rain seeping into her bones, the cold knowledge that she had become entertainment. The great Vance family, once proud, now reduced to a girl begging in the mud for a puppy while her childhood home was parceled out to creditors. £40, someone called from the back, a grain merchant by the look of his coat. 45, countered Mrs. Caldwell, her voice bright with vindictive pleasure. Ghost was crying now, high-pitched, keening whines that made Elowen's chest feel as though it were caving in. She wrenched against the bailiff's grip, feeling something in her shoulder pop, but he only tightened his hold. 48, the grain merchant shouted. The lead bailiff grinned, holding Ghost higher like a trophy. The puppy's black eyes found Elowen's, wide with terror, and she felt something inside her shatter. This was how her father must have felt, she thought distantly, when the cards kept turning against him. This helpless, drowning desperation. 50! Mrs. Caldwell's voice rang out triumphant. £50, and I'll take him now. The bailiff nodded, already turning toward the milliner. Sold to. The black carriage door opened. It didn't slam or creak. It simply opened, smooth and deliberate, and the entire courtyard fell silent. Even the rain seemed to pause, holding its breath. The man who stepped out was tall enough that he had to duck slightly, his greatcoat black as pitch and streaming water. He moved like smoke given form, each step precise, unhurried. The crowd parted without being asked, instinct driving them back from something they recognized as dangerous. Elowen had never seen the Duke of Oakhaven before. No one in Thornhill had, not in the 6 years since he'd inherited the title and retreated to his northern estate. But she knew him instantly by the way silence spread in his wake, by the way even the bailiffs straightened, uncertainty flickering across their faces. He was younger than she'd expected, 30 perhaps, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a face carved from something harder than marble. His eyes swept the courtyard once, taking in the scattered furniture, the mud, the gawking neighbors. Then they found Elowen, still held fast by the bailiff, and something shifted in his expression, something cold and sharp as a blade drawn in moonlight. He walked toward the lead bailiff, who still held Ghost suspended in the air. The puppy had gone quiet, trembling violently. "Put it down," the Duke said. His voice was low, barely above a conversational tone, but it carried like thunder. The bailiff blinked. "Your Grace, this is an official settlement." Lord Vane's instruction. The Duke reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch. He tossed it at the bailiff's feet, where it landed with a heavy, unmistakable clink of gold. "The Vance debt, all of it. I'm buying the contract." The bailiff stared at the pouch, then at the Duke. "That's, Your Grace, that's £40,000. "I'm aware." The Duke's gaze hadn't moved from Ghost. "Put it down." The bailiff set the puppy on the ground so quickly he nearly dropped him. Ghost scrambled across the mud toward Elowen, but the other bailiff still held her arm. The Duke's eyes shifted to him, and the man released Elowen as though she'd caught fire. She collapsed forward, catching Ghost against her chest as the puppy burrowed into her arms, shaking so hard she could feel his heartbeat against her ribs. She pressed her face into his wet fur, finally letting the tears come, hot and silent. When she looked up, the Duke was standing over her, a wraith in fine wool, haloed by rain and the gray morning light. "The girl," he said quietly, to no one and everyone. "And the beast." He held out his hand. "They are mine." The Duke's hand remained extended, pale and steady in the rain. Elowen stared at it, her mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. £40,000. He'd said it as though it were nothing, as though he hadn't just purchased her entire family's ruin with the same indifference another man might buy a horse. Ghost whimpered against her chest, and she realized she was clutching him too tightly. She loosened her grip, but didn't move, didn't reach for the Duke's hand. Around them, the crowd had gone utterly still, a tableau of shock and avid curiosity. "Miss Vance." The Duke's voice held no impatience, but something in it made her look up. His eyes were gray, she noticed. Not the warm gray of summer stone, but the cold gray of winter sea. The mud is no place for either of you. It wasn't a request. Elowen's legs trembled as she tried to stand, her dress heavy with rainwater and filth. She made it halfway up before her knees buckled. And then the Duke's hand was on her elbow, steadying her with a grip that was surprisingly gentle for a man who'd just commanded a crowd of bailiffs like they were unruly dogs. "I can walk," she said, though her voice shook. "I don't doubt it." But he didn't release her, guiding her across the courtyard toward his carriage. Ghost pressed against her collarbone, his small body still trembling violently. Behind them, the lead bailiff found his voice. "Your Grace, the paperwork. Lord Vane will need proper documentation of the transfer." The Duke didn't turn. "Send it to Oakhaven. My solicitor will handle it." "But the terms, Your Grace, the repayment schedule." "There is no schedule." The Duke opened the carriage door himself, rather than waiting for his driver. "The debt is purchased in full. Tell Lord Vane if he has questions, he may direct them to me personally." The way he said it made it clear that Lord Vane would be a fool to do so. Elowen climbed into the carriage, her wet skirts catching on the step. The interior was warm, blessedly warm, with charcoal braziers tucked beneath the seats and velvet cushions the color of deep wine. It smelled of leather and something else, something like cedar and smoke. She sank into the far corner, still holding Ghost, trying to make herself as small as possible. The Duke settled across from her, his long legs taking up most of the space between the seats. He rapped twice on the ceiling, and the carriage lurched into motion. Through the window, Elowen watched her childhood home recede into the rain. The crowd was already dispersing, no doubt rushing to spread word of what they'd witnessed. Mrs. Caldwell stood frozen by the auctioneer's table, her face twisted with fury at being cheated of her prize. The bailiffs were counting the gold from the pouch, their heads bent together like conspirators. "They'll talk," Elowen said quietly, not sure why she was speaking at all. "About this. About you taking me." They were already talking. The Duke's gaze was fixed somewhere past her shoulder, out at the gray morning. At least now they'll have something interesting to say. Ghost chose that moment to poke his head out from Elowen's arms, his black button nose twitching as he assessed this new environment. His tail, barely more than a tuft of white fluff, gave a tentative wag. The Duke's eyes dropped to the puppy, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not quite softness, but a lessening of the severe line of his mouth. "Maltese," he said. "Your father bought him in Dover, didn't he? From the Dutch merchant ship that came in last spring." Elowen's head snapped up. "How did you—" "I was there when he made the purchase." The Duke leaned back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. £200 for breeding stock, though I suspect he told your mother it was considerably less." £200. Elowen felt sick. She'd known Ghost was expensive, had known her father's gift had been extravagant, but £200 when they were already drowning in debt. "You knew my father." It wasn't a question. "I did." Something crossed the Duke's face, too quick to read. "Before the gambling took hold, Silas Vance was one of the sharpest men I'd ever met. He taught me more about estate management in 6 months than my own father had in 20 years. Elowen stared at him. Her father? Teaching a duke? It seemed impossible, but then again 6 years ago her father had been different. Before her mother's illness. Before the cards and dice had become his only companions. "He was your mentor," she said slowly. "He was?" The Duke's voice held no emotion, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Which is why I've been monitoring his debts for the past 3 years. The carriage swayed as they turned onto the main road, heading north, toward Oakhaven. Elowen gripped the seat to steady herself, her mind reeling. You've been watching us? Watching our family fall apart? I've been waiting, the Duke corrected, for the debt to consolidate enough that I could purchase it all at once. Lord Vane has been buying up your father's notes from various creditors, piece by piece, with the intention of seizing your estate. I simply beat him to it. Why? The word came out sharper than she'd intended. Why would you spend £40,000 on someone else's failure? The Duke's eyes met hers, finally, and in them she saw something that made her breath catch. Not pity, which she could have borne, not even kindness, but a dark, determined purpose that was somehow more frightening than either. Because I owe your father a debt that has nothing to do with money, he said quietly. And because Lord Vane is a snake who profits from other men's misery. He was the one who introduced your father to the gambling dens in the first place, then bought up the losses when Silas couldn't stop. Elowen's hands tightened in Ghost's fur. He set a trap. He set several. The Duke's voice had gone cold again. Your father walked into them willingly, but Vane made certain the doors locked behind him. He wanted the Vance lands because they border mine. A strategic acquisition. The pieces were falling into place now, horrible and clear. And now you have the debt instead. Yes. So what does that make me? Elowen asked, lifting her chin despite the fear coiling in her stomach. Your strategic acquisition? The Duke regarded her for a long moment, rain streaming down the carriage windows behind him, turning his face into something carved from shadow and light. You, he said, are the daughter of a man I once respected, and you are currently soaked to the bone, covered in mud, and holding a traumatized puppy. What you are not is anyone's acquisition. Not Vane's, not the bailiffs, and not mine. He reached forward and pulled a thick woolen blanket from a compartment beneath his seat, offering it to her. You're shaking. Elowen took the blanket with numb fingers, wrapping it around herself and Ghost. The puppy immediately burrowed deeper, finally beginning to calm. Then what am I doing here? She whispered. If you don't intend to, if I'm not, you're going to Oakhaven, the Duke said, settling back into his seat, where you and that creature will be warm, fed, and safe. And then, Miss Vance, you're going to help me destroy the man who destroyed your father. The carriage rolled on through the rain, carrying her away from everything she'd known, toward a darkness she couldn't yet see. But for the first time since her father had disappeared into his debts and her mother had died calling his name, Elowen felt something other than helpless grief. She felt the sharp, bitter edge of purpose. Oakhaven appeared through the rain like something from a fever dream, all dark stone and towering spires that seemed to claw at the gray sky. The estate sprawled across the hilltop, larger than Elowen had imagined, its windows reflecting nothing but clouds and mist. No warm light glowed from within. No smoke rose from the chimneys, though it was cold enough that her breath misted inside the carriage. It looked, she thought distantly, exactly like the sort of place a man would go to disappear from the world. The carriage rolled to a stop before massive oak doors, their surfaces carved with intricate patterns that had gone dark with age and weather. The Duke descended first, not waiting for his driver, and once again offered his hand to Elowen. This time she took it, her legs still unsteady beneath her. Ghost poked his head out from the blanket, his ears perking forward with cautious interest. least the puppy had stopped shaking. The doors opened before they reached them, swung wide by a butler so ancient he made the one at Nightshade Estate seem youthful by comparison. His face was a map of wrinkles, his spine curved with age, but his eyes were sharp as he took in Elowen's bedraggled state. "Mrs. Petra," the Duke said without preamble, "is the East Wing prepared?" "The Rose Room, Your Grace, as you instructed this morning." The butler's voice was surprisingly strong. He gestured to a severe-looking woman in a housekeeper's black dress who had materialized from the shadows of the entrance hall. "Mrs. Petra will see to the young lady's needs." Mrs. Petra's gaze swept over Elowen with the cool assessment of someone evaluating livestock. Her mouth, already thin, pressed into an even tighter line. "Very good, Your Grace. Should I send for additional staff? The girl will require, whatever she requires, provided." The Duke was already moving toward a corridor to the left, his greatcoat dripping onto the polished marble floor. "I'll be in my study. See that I'm not disturbed." And just like that, he was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the house as though he'd never been there at all. Elowen stood in the entrance hall, still wrapped in the blanket, holding Ghost against her chest, and felt the first cold finger of real fear trace down her spine. The hall was vast and empty, its ceiling so high it disappeared into shadow. Portraits lined the walls, stern-faced men and women who seemed to watch her with disapproval. The air smelled of beeswax and disuse, and when Mrs. Petra's shoes clicked against the floor, the sound echoed like gunshots. "This way, miss." The housekeeper's tone made it clear the honorific was a courtesy, not a conviction. Elowen followed, clutching Ghost tighter. They climbed a grand staircase, its banister carved from the same dark wood as the front doors, then turned down a corridor lined with more portraits and closed doors. So many closed doors. The house felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum, beautiful and cold and utterly lifeless. The Rose Room, when Mrs. Petra finally stopped before it, was anything but rose-colored. The walls were papered in a faded damask that might have once been pink but had aged to the color of old bruises. The four-poster bed was draped in heavy velvet curtains, the furniture was ornate but dusty, and a fire had been laid in the hearth but not yet lit. "I'll send a maid with water for washing," Mrs. Petra said, her hand already on the door. "Supper is at 7. His Grace dines alone, so you'll take your meals in your room." "Wait." Elowen's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "Please, I need to know. What am I doing here? What does the Duke expect of me?" Mrs. Petra's expression didn't soften, but something flickered in her eyes. Pity, perhaps, or recognition. "His Grace's expectations are his own business, miss. My expectation is that you'll keep to your room, stay out of trouble, and not make more work for my girls. We're already stretched thin as it is." The door closed with a soft click, and Elowen heard the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock. She stood frozen for a moment, Ghost warm and solid in her arms, and then she crossed to the door and tried the handle. Locked. Of course it was locked. A golden cage, she thought bitterly. She'd traded the bailiff's rough hands and Mrs. Caldwell's vindictive spite for velvet curtains and locked doors. But a cage was still a cage, no matter how fine the bars. Ghost squirmed, and she set him down on the carpet. He immediately began exploring, his little nose working overtime as he investigated every corner of the room. When he reached the fireplace, he sat down and looked back at her expectantly, as if to say, "Well, aren't you going to do something about this cold?" "I don't know how to light it," Elowen whispered to him. At home, no, at the place that used to be home, The servants had always handled the fires. She'd never learned because she'd never needed to learn. Young ladies of good families didn't concern themselves with such things. But she wasn't a young lady of a good family anymore, was she? She was a debt, a burden, a girl the Duke had purchased along with her father's failures. She knelt before the hearth anyway, studying the careful arrangement of kindling and coal. There was a tinderbox on the mantel, and after several attempts that left her fingers blackened and her eyes stinging with smoke, she managed to coax a flame to life. Ghost immediately curled up before it, his white fur going golden in the firelight, and closed his eyes with a contented sigh. If only it were so simple for her. Elowen moved to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain. Rain still fell in sheets, obscuring the view, but she could make out the shapes of gardens below, overgrown and wild. Beyond them, the land rolled away into forest, dark and dense and endless. No other houses were visible, no lights from nearby estates or villages. They were completely isolated. She pressed her hand against the cold glass and thought about the Duke's words in the carriage. "You're going to help me destroy the man who destroyed your father." It had sounded like salvation then, like purpose and righteous anger. But now, locked in this room, in this tomb of a house, it felt different. What if the Duke was simply another version of Lord Vane? Another powerful man who saw her as a piece on his game board, useful only insofar as she served his own ends. He'd known about her father's debts for 3 years and done nothing until it suited his purposes. He'd let her family suffer, let her mother die in a house being stripped bare around her, and only intervened when Vane's plans intersected with his own. A knock at the door made her jump. She heard the key turn again, and a young maid entered carrying a pitcher of steaming water and an armful of linens. The girl couldn't have been more than 15, thin and pale with nervous hands. "Begging your pardon, miss," she said, setting everything on the washstand. "Mrs. Petra said you'd need these, and she said—" The girl hesitated, glancing at the door as though afraid of being overheard. "She said to tell you there's a bell pull by the bed if you need anything, and that the door will stay unlocked during the day. But His Grace's orders are that it's to be locked at night. For your safety," she says. "My safety," Elowen repeated hollowly. "From what?" The maid's eyes went wide. "I don't know, miss. I don't ask questions. None of us do." She fled before Elowen could say anything else, the door clicking shut behind her. This time the lock didn't turn. Elowen sank onto the edge of the bed, her wet dress seeping cold into the velvet coverlet. Ghost padded over from the fire and jumped up beside her, his small weight settling against her thigh. She'd escaped the auction. She'd saved Ghost from Mrs. Caldwell's vindictive hands. But as thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance and the fire cast dancing shadows across the faded wallpaper, Elowen couldn't shake the feeling that she'd simply exchanged one form of captivity for another. The Duke had bought her father's debts, which meant, no matter how he phrased it, no matter how he spoke of respect and old friendships, he owned her just as surely as Vane would have. And she had no idea what price he would eventually demand for her freedom. Elowen woke to darkness and the sound of Ghost whimpering. She sat up, disoriented, her heart pounding. The fire had burned down to embers, casting barely enough light to see by, and for a moment she couldn't remember where she was. Then it came back in a cold rush. Oakhaven, the locked door, the Duke's gray eyes. Ghost whimpered again, and she realized he wasn't in the bed beside her. She'd fallen asleep in her clothes, too exhausted to even remove her muddy dress. And the puppy must have wandered off while she slept. "Ghost?" she whispered, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. The floor was ice cold beneath her bare feet. "Where are you?" Another whimper, this one from the direction of the door. She crossed to it, her eyes adjusting to the dimness, and found Ghost scratching at the wood, his little tail wagging urgently. "You can't go out," she told him, reaching for the handle anyway. "It's locked, remember? The door swung open under her hand, unlocked during the day, the maid had said. But it was the middle of the night, wasn't it? Unless she'd slept longer than she thought. Elowen peered into the corridor, seeing nothing but darkness and the faint glow of what might be candlelight somewhere far down the hall. Ghost darted through the opening before she could stop him, his white form disappearing into the shadows like a ghost in truth. "No, wait!" Elowen lunged after him, her heart in her throat. The puppy was too young, too small to be wandering around this massive, strange house alone. He could fall downstairs, get lost in some forgotten wing, or worse. She followed the sound of his paws pattering against the floor, down the corridor and around a corner. The house was even more unsettling at night, full of creaking sounds and shifting shadows. The portraits on the walls seemed to follow her with their painted eyes, and more than once she thought she saw movement in her peripheral vision, only to find nothing when she turned. "Ghost, please," she hissed, trying to keep her voice low. The last thing she needed was to wake the Duke or his servants by chasing a puppy through the halls like a madwoman. The puppy's tail disappeared around another corner, heading toward the front of the house. Elowen gathered her skirts and followed, her breath coming faster now. What if Ghost scratched at the Duke's door? What if he woke him? She'd been here less than a day and was already proving Mrs. Petra's worst assumptions correct. She rounded the corner and found herself in a part of the house she didn't recognize. The corridor was wider here, the doors larger and more ornate. One of them stood ajar, warm light spilling through the gap, and she could hear Ghost's excited yipping from inside. Oh no. Elowen approached slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. Through the opening, she could see what appeared to be a study, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive desk covered in papers, and a fire burning in the hearth. And there, sitting on the carpet before the fire, was Ghost. The Duke sat in a wingback chair beside him, still fully dressed despite the late hour, a book open in his lap. He'd removed his coat, and his shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms marked with old scars. He was looking down at Ghost with an expression Elowen couldn't quite read. "I apologize, Your Grace," she said quickly, stepping into the doorway. "I fell asleep and he got out. I'll take him back to—" She stopped. Ghost had his front paws up on the Duke's knee, his tail wagging so hard his entire back end wiggled with it. The puppy was making small, pleading sounds, the same ones he made when he wanted to be held. And the Duke, the cold, severe Duke of Oakhaven, who'd commanded bailiffs like soldiers and spoken of destroying enemies, was scratching Ghost behind the ears with the kind of gentle attention usually reserved for something infinitely precious. "He's persistent," the Duke said, not looking up from the puppy. "I heard him in the corridor 10 minutes ago and opened the door to see what the commotion was. He came straight to me as though we were old friends." Elowen stared, unable to reconcile what she was seeing with the man who'd left her, locked in a room without a backward glance. He's usually shy with strangers. It takes him ages to warm up to new people. Perhaps he doesn't consider me a stranger. The Duke's mouth quirked. Not quite a smile, but something softer than his usual severity. Animals often have better judgment than humans. Ghost chose that moment to lick the Duke's hand, then tried to climb into his lap, his small paws scrabbling at expensive wool. The Duke set his book aside and lifted the puppy with both hands, settling him against his chest. Ghost immediately burrowed under the Duke's chin, giving a contented sigh that Elowen felt in her own chest. The puppy had never done that with anyone except her and her mother. "I didn't mean to disturb you," Elowen said quietly, something shifting in her understanding of the man before her. "You said you'd be in your study, but I didn't realize you'd still be working at this hour." "I don't sleep much." The Duke's hand moved in slow, rhythmic strokes down Ghost's back, and the puppy's eyes were already drooping. "Haven't for years. The house is quieter at night. Easier to think." Elowen took a hesitant step into the room. Now that she was closer, she could see the shadows beneath the Duke's eyes, the tension in his shoulders despite his careful gentleness with Ghost. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with late hours and everything to do with burdens carried too long. "What are you working on?" she asked, then immediately regretted it. It wasn't her place to ask. She was here on sufferance, a debt purchased and stored away in the East Wing like unwanted furniture. But the Duke didn't seem offended. He glanced at the papers spread across his desk, his expression darkening. "Your father's ledgers, or what's left of them. Vane was thorough in his destruction, but not quite thorough enough. There are discrepancies in the dates, amounts that don't match the original contracts." Elowen moved closer, drawn despite herself. "You think he altered them?" "I think he created them." The Duke shifted Ghost to one arm, reaching for a particular document with his free hand. "Your father's signature appears on a promissory note dated March 15th, 3 years ago. But I have a letter from Silas dated March 20th of that same year, written from your estate, discussing plans to visit London in April." He couldn't have signed a note in a London gambling den if he wasn't in London. Hope, dangerous and sharp, flickered in Elowen's chest. He was framed. Some of it, at least. Perhaps not all. The Duke's honesty was brutal, but not unkind. "Your father did gamble, Miss Vance. I won't lie to you about that. But the scope of the debt, the speed at which it accumulated, that was Vane's engineering." Ghost had fallen completely asleep now, a warm weight against the Duke's chest. Elowen watched the rise and fall of the puppy's breathing, the complete trust in every relaxed line of his small body, and felt something in her own chest loosen. Her mother used to say that Ghost was special, that Maltese had been bred for centuries to be companions to royalty, and could sense a person's true nature. Elowen had always thought it was just a pretty story. The kind mothers told to make an extravagant gift seem more meaningful. But Ghost had bitten the bailiff who tried to take him, had growled at Mrs. Caldwell when she'd bid on him at the auction, had trembled and hidden from every stranger who'd come to the estate in those final, awful weeks. And here he was, asleep in the arms of the Duke of Oakhaven, as peaceful as though he'd finally come home. "He likes you," Elowen said softly. The Duke looked down at Ghost, something unreadable crossing his face. "He's a good judge of character, then. Or a terrible one. I haven't decided which." "Why did you buy the debt?" The question came out before Elowen could stop it. "You said you owed my father. But £40,000. That's more than obligation. That's, your father saved my life." The Duke's voice had gone quiet, and he still wasn't looking at her, his gaze fixed on the sleeping puppy. "I was 24, newly inherited, and drowning in an estate I didn't understand and a title I didn't want. My own father had been a wastrel who'd spent his final years drinking himself to death and leaving debts in every corner of England. Silas Vance took one look at my books and told me I had 6 months before the creditors would take everything." He paused, his hand stilling on Ghost's back. He spent those 6 months teaching me how to salvage what could be saved and how to negotiate with those who couldn't be reasoned with. He never asked for payment, never even asked for gratitude, he said. The Duke's jaw tightened. He said that good men had to help each other, because the world had more than enough of the other kind. Elowen felt tears prick her eyes. That sounded like her father, like the man he'd been before grief and guilt had hollowed him out. So when he started to fall, she said, understanding now, you tried to catch him. I tried. The Duke finally looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the weight of failure, of watching someone drown and being unable to reach them in time. But he wouldn't accept help, wouldn't even acknowledge there was a problem until it was too late. By the time I realized Vane was involved, the damage was already done. Ghost stirred, making a small sound in his sleep. The Duke immediately gentled his hold, adjusting so the puppy could settle more comfortably. It was such a small gesture, unconscious and kind, and it told Elowen more about the Duke's true nature than any words could have. I'm sorry I doubted you, she whispered. Earlier in the room, I thought, you thought you'd traded one captor for another. The Duke's voice held no accusation, only tired understanding. I would have thought the same in your position. But I need you to understand something, Miss Vance. You are not a prisoner here. The door was locked for your protection, not your imprisonment. And tomorrow, if you choose to leave, I'll have my carriage take you anywhere you wish to go. Elowen stared at him. You'd let me go? Just like that? Just like that. He met her gaze steadily. Though I hope you'll stay. Not because I own your father's debt, but because I think you want the same thing I do. What's that? The Duke's expression hardened, and she saw the steel beneath the gentleness, the dangerous purpose that had bought her freedom and brought her here. Justice, he said, and revenge. The library at Oakhaven was nothing like the modest collection of books Elowen's family had once kept in their sitting room. It sprawled across 2 floors, accessible by a narrow spiral staircase tucked into the corner, with windows that stretched from floor to ceiling and let in the pale morning light. The smell of old leather and paper hung in the air like incense, and everywhere she looked, books climbed toward the vaulted ceiling in neat, organized rows. Ghost trotted beside her, his nails clicking softly against the polished floor. After last night's encounter in the Duke's study, the puppy had developed an unfortunate habit of trying to escape the Rose Room at every opportunity, clearly hoping for another visit with his new favorite person. Elowen had given up trying to confine him and simply let him follow her as she explored the parts of the house Mrs. Petra had grudgingly indicated were acceptable for her use. The library, apparently, was one of them. She ran her fingers along the spines of books as she walked, reading titles in Latin and Greek, French and German. Medical texts sat beside philosophical treatises. Agricultural manuals shared shelves with poetry. It was the collection of someone who read not for pleasure alone, but to understand the world in all its complexity. Ghost stopped suddenly, his ears perking forward. He trotted toward a section of shelving near the back corner, where the light didn't quite reach, and began pawing at something on the floor. What did you find? Elowen followed him, crouching down to see what had caught his attention. A book had fallen, or been placed, on the floor, half hidden behind a leather armchair that looked like it hadn't been moved in years. She picked it up, expecting a novel, or perhaps a ledger of household accounts. Instead, she found herself holding a journal bound in cracked brown leather, her father's initials embossed in gold on the cover. S.V. Her breath caught. She opened it carefully, the spine protesting with a soft crack, and saw her father's handwriting flowing across the first page in the neat, precise script she remembered from her childhood. Estate management principles, as discussed with C.M., Duke of Oakhaven. September 1868. The entries that followed were notes from her father's lessons with the Duke, methods for crop rotation, strategies for negotiating with tenants, calculations for sustainable timber harvesting. Her father's enthusiasm bled through every line, his natural gift for teaching evident even in notes meant only for himself. Elowen sank into the armchair, Ghost jumping up to settle beside her, and turned the pages slowly. The journal chronicled 2 years of collaboration between her father and the Duke, showing a friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. There were personal notes, too, mentions of her mother's health, of Elowen's progress in her studies, of hopes for the family's future. Then the entries changed. March 1871. The headaches have worsened. Margaret insists I see the physician, but I cannot bear to hear what he might say. C.M. has noticed my distraction. I've made excuses. April 1871. The physician confirms my fears. The same affliction that took my father, deterioration of the mind, progressive and incurable. Margaret doesn't know. I cannot tell her. How do I explain that I will slowly forget everything, everyone I love? Elowen's hands trembled. She'd known her father had become distant, distracted, but she'd attributed it to grief over her mother's illness, to the stress of mounting debts. She'd never known he was sick himself. May 1871. Met Lord Vane at the club. He was sympathetic about Margaret's condition, offered to help with medical expenses. Signed a note for £500 at favorable terms. C.M. would disapprove, but I cannot ask him for charity. Not when I know what's coming. The entries grew more erratic after that, the handwriting less controlled. Her father wrote of confusion, of lost time, of waking up in places he didn't remember going, and threaded through it all. More notes signed with Lord Vane, amounts growing larger, terms growing more desperate. But then, wedged between 2 pages near the back of the journal, Elowen found a loose sheet of paper that didn't match the others. It was newer, the ink fresher, and it bore her father's signature at the bottom. But the handwriting above the signature wasn't his. She held it up to the light, her heart pounding. The document was a promissory note for £12,000, dated June 15th, 1873, just 6 months ago. But the handwriting was too smooth, too controlled to be her father's. By that time, according to the journal entries, he could barely write his own name without his hand shaking. "What are you reading?" Elowen jumped, nearly dropping the paper. The Duke stood in the library doorway, still in his riding clothes, his dark hair windswept. Ghost immediately leapt from the chair and bounded toward him, tail wagging furiously. "I found," Elowen's voice cracked. She held up the journal. "My father's journal, from when he was working with you, and this." She held out the promissory note with shaking hands. The Duke crossed to her in 3 long strides, Ghost trotting at his heels. He took the paper, his expression darkening as he scanned it. "Where did you find this?" "Inside the journal, between the pages." Elowen stood, her legs unsteady. "That's not his handwriting, is it? Not the body of the note, only the signature?" "No." The Duke's voice had gone cold, the same dangerous coldness she'd heard when he'd faced down the bailiffs. "This is forgery. Skilled forgery, but forgery nonetheless. Your father's signature is genuine. I'd know his hand anywhere, but the rest..." He held the paper up to the window, examining it more closely. "The rest was written by someone else and signed later. You can see where the ink bleeds differently." Elowen felt dizzy. He was sick. The journal says he was sick, that his mind was deteriorating. Lord Vane must have known, must have taken advantage. He did more than take advantage. The Duke's jaw tightened. He created debt that didn't exist and used your father's illness to cover his tracks. A man who can barely remember his own name can't dispute notes he doesn't remember signing. But the signature is real, Elowen said, her mind racing. So my father did sign something, just not this. The Duke moved to his desk, which occupied a sunny corner of the library, and pulled out a drawer. He withdrew a stack of papers, spreading them across the surface. I've been comparing the documents Vane submitted to the creditors' court with the original contracts I could recover. Look at this one. He pointed to a note dated March 15th, 1872, one of the dates he'd mentioned the night before. The amount says £8,000. But see here. He indicated a faint line beneath the number 8. That used to be a 3. Someone altered it after your father signed. Elowen leaned closer, her breath catching. He was right. The number had been changed, carefully, but not perfectly. How many are like this? At least a dozen that I've found so far. The Duke's expression was grim. And those are only the ones I have access to. Vane likely has more locked away in his own collection. Documents he'll produce if challenged, all showing debts your father supposedly agreed to. Ghost, sensing the tension in the room, had abandoned his usual playfulness and sat quietly at the Duke's feet, watching them both with anxious eyes. Elowen sank back into the chair, the journal heavy in her lap. He was dying. My father was dying, and Vane used it to steal everything we had. Yes. The Duke didn't soften the truth, but his voice held a gentle understanding. The illness your father described, I've seen it before. My own grandfather suffered from it in his final years. The mind deteriorates slowly, memory and judgment failing long before the body gives out. Your father likely signed legitimate notes in the beginning, when he could still understand what he was doing, and Vane altered them later. Then, as the illness progressed, Vane probably had him sign blank documents, filling in whatever amounts suited his purposes. Where's my father now? Elowen asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. If he was that ill 6 months ago, he couldn't have just disappeared. The Duke's silence told her everything. He's dead, she whispered. Isn't he? I don't know. The Duke's honesty was stark. He vanished 3 months ago. No one has seen him since he left your estate with Vane's gold. He could be in an asylum somewhere, placed there by Vane to keep him quiet. He could be. He stopped, unwilling to voice the darker possibilities. Elowen pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting back tears. Her father, her brilliant, kind father, who had taught a young duke how to save his estate, who had loved her mother with such devotion, he'd been sick and afraid and alone, manipulated by a monster who saw profit in his suffering. I want to destroy him, she said, her voice shaking with rage instead of grief. Lord Vane, I want to take everything from him the way he took everything from my family. The Duke studied her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. A recognition, perhaps, of finding an ally who understood the depth of what needed to be done. Then we'll need more than altered ledgers and a forged promissory note, he said quietly. We'll need proof that Vane knew about your father's illness and exploited it deliberately. We'll need witnesses, documentation, evidence that can stand up in court. Where do we find that? The Duke's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, something colder and more dangerous. In Vane's own house. He's too arrogant to have destroyed everything. Men like him keep trophies of their victories, proof of their cleverness. We just need to find where he's hidden them." Ghost stood up suddenly, his tail beginning to wag again, as though he could sense that the conversation had shifted from grief to purpose. He looked between Elowen and the Duke, then back again, his dark eyes bright with the simple confidence that everything would be all right now that the pack was together. Elowen reached down to scratch his ears, drawing strength from his certainty. Her father had tried to protect them by suffering alone, keeping his illness secret even as it destroyed him, but she wouldn't make the same mistake. She had an ally now, a powerful one, and together they would uncover the truth. "When do we start?" she asked. The Duke gathered up the forged documents, his movements precise and controlled. "Tomorrow night. Vane is hosting a ball, a celebration of his recent acquisition of the Thornhill merchant contracts. Half of London's elite will be there, which means his study will be unguarded." "You want us to break into his house during a ball?" "I want us to walk in through the front door, like invited guests," the Duke corrected. "Charm our way through the crowds, and then slip away when no one's watching to search his private papers." He looked at her, one eyebrow raised. "Unless you'd prefer to wait for a quieter opportunity. Say, 6 months from now, when the trail has gone completely cold?" Elowen thought of her father's shaking handwriting, of the journal entries that chronicled his desperate attempt to manage an illness that would steal everything he was. She thought of Lord Vane, celebrating his victories while her family's name drowned in manufactured debt. "No," she said, standing up and squaring her shoulders. "Tomorrow night is perfect." The Duke nodded, something like approval flickering in his gray eyes. "Then we'd better find you a ball gown. The one you wore to the auction won't do." Despite everything, Elowen felt a wild laugh bubble up in her throat. 2 days ago she'd been standing in the mud, watching her life be sold piece by piece. Now she was planning to infiltrate a lord's mansion to steal evidence of fraud. Ghost barked once, sharp and approving, and the Duke reached down to scratch him behind the ears. "Good boy," he murmured. "You found exactly what we needed." The puppy's tail wagged harder, and Elowen realized with a strange jolt that Ghost hadn't found the journal by accident. He'd gone straight to it, as though he'd known it was important, as though he'd understood they needed it. Her mother had been right. Maltese really did have a sense for these things. The morning had barely broken when the sound of carriage wheels on gravel shattered the quiet of Oakhaven. Elowen was in the library with Ghost, studying maps of Lord Vane's London residence that the Duke had procured from somewhere, when she heard raised voices from the entrance hall below. Mrs. Petra's sharp tone cut through first, then a man's voice, smooth, cultured, and utterly convinced of its own authority. Ghost's ears flattened against his head, and a low growl rumbled in his small chest. Elowen had never heard him make such a sound before. She gathered him into her arms and moved to the library door, cracking it open just enough to hear more clearly. The voices were coming from the front of the house, growing louder as someone climbed the main staircase. "I don't care if His Grace is indisposed," the unfamiliar voice said. "Tell him Lord Matthias Vane is here on urgent business concerning a debt he's recently acquired. He'll see me." Elowen's blood went cold. Vane. Here, at Oakhaven. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door, her heart hammering. Ghost continued his low, constant growl, his small body rigid with tension. "His Grace did not indicate he was expecting visitors," Mrs. Petra said icily. "If you'll wait I'll wait nowhere." Footsteps echoed in the corridor, moving closer to the library. "I know she's here. The Vance girl. My property, purchased fair and square before your master swooped in with his theatrical rescue." Miss Vance is a guest of this house, Mrs. Petra said, her voice rising. You have no authority. I have every authority. Vane's voice had taken on a harder edge. I hold a private note signed by Silas Vance 3 weeks before his disappearance, pledging his daughter's services as lady's companion to my mother for a period of 5 years in exchange for forgiveness of £12,000 in gambling debts. The Duke may have bought the public debts, but this one is mine. Elowen felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. A private note. Her father had sold her into servitude, and she'd never known. That's a lie, she heard herself say, stepping into the corridor before she could think better of it. Ghost was still growling in her arms, his small body trembling with rage rather than fear. Lord Vane turned to face her, and she finally saw the man who had destroyed her family. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of handsome features that would have been called distinguished in better company. His clothes were expensive, his manner refined, and his smile was the coldest thing she'd ever seen. Miss Vance, he said, executing a mocking bow. How delightful to finally meet you properly. Your father spoke of you often during our games, said you had your mother's stubbornness. His eyes traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. I can see he was right. My father would never have sold me into servitude, Elowen said, though even as she spoke, doubt crept in. The journal had shown how desperate he'd been, how confused. Could Vane have convinced him it was the only way to protect her? Wouldn't he? Vane withdrew a folded document from his coat. His signature says otherwise. Witnessed and notarized, perfectly legal. You see, the Duke may have theatrical timing, but I have the law on my side. Let me see that. The Duke's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He emerged from a side corridor, still in his shirt sleeves, his hair damp as though he'd just come from washing. His eyes went immediately to Vane, and the temperature in the hall seemed to drop 10 degrees. Vane's smile widened. Mordrake. Still playing the noble savior, I see. It's quite touching, really, how you've taken up your old mentor's lost causes. Though I must say, housing his daughter in your estate unchaperoned is bound to cause talk. Give me the document, the Duke repeated, holding out his hand. Vane made a show of considering, then shrugged and handed it over. By all means. You'll find everything in order. The Duke scanned the page, his expression unreadable. Elowen watched his eyes move across the text, looking for some sign that it was another forgery, another of Vane's manipulations. But when he looked up, his face was grim. This is dated February 10th, he said quietly. 3 weeks before Silas disappeared. As I said, Vane's tone was triumphant. A private agreement between gentleman and debtor. Nothing to do with the public debts you purchased. Miss Vance owes me 5 years of service, and I've come to collect. Ghost lunged forward in Elowen's arms, snapping at the air between them and Vane. The Lord stepped back, his refined mask slipping for just a moment to show disgust. Control that beast, or I'll have it destroyed as a menace. Touch him and I'll break your hand, Elowen said, surprising herself with the venom in her voice. Vane's eyes narrowed. You're in no position to make threats, girl. You're mine now, bought and paid for. Your father made sure of that before he ran off to whatever hole he's drinking himself to death in. My father is dead, Elowen said, the words coming out flat and certain, though she had no proof. Or you've hidden him somewhere to keep him from contradicting your lies. Either way, this note is as much a forgery as all the others. Something flickered in Vane's expression, just for a moment, but she saw it. Surprised that she knew about the forgeries, and beneath that, calculation. Bold accusations from someone with no proof, he said smoothly. But then, desperation does make people reckless. Ask your noble protector here. He knows all about reckless accusations. The Duke's hand tightened on the document. What are you implying, Vane? I'm not implying anything. Vane's smile returned, sharper now. I'm simply observing that you have quite a lot riding on this particular game. The Oakhaven estate, for instance. Still mortgaged to the hilt, isn't it? Despite all Silas Vance's excellent advice about estate management. Elowen's head snapped toward the Duke. What is he talking about? Nothing that concerns you, the Duke said. But his voice had lost some of its certainty. Oh, but it does concern her. Vane was clearly enjoying himself now. You see, Miss Vance, the Duke's noble rescue of you wasn't entirely altruistic. He needs to destroy me just as badly as you do, because I hold the mortgage on Oakhaven. £45,000, due in full by the end of the year. If he can't pay, this entire estate becomes mine. The corridor seemed to tilt again. Elowen stared at the Duke, waiting for him to deny it, to tell her it was another of Vane's lies. But the Duke said nothing, and his silence was answer enough. You didn't tell her? Vane laughed, a cold, delighted sound. Oh, this is even better than I thought. She actually believed you were helping her out of the goodness of your heart. How sweetly naive. Get out, the Duke said, his voice low and dangerous. Now. I'll leave, Vane agreed, plucking the document from the Duke's hand. But I'll be back in 3 days with the magistrate and a formal writ of service. You can keep the girl until then, consider it a farewell gift. But come Thursday, she's mine, and there's nothing you or your mortgaged estate can do about it. He turned to Elowen, his smile poisonous. Pack lightly, my dear. My mother's estate in Cornwall is quite remote. You won't be needing ball gowns. Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the stairs, leaving silence and the acrid smell of expensive cologne in his wake. Elowen stood frozen, still holding Ghost, her mind trying to process everything that had just happened. The Duke was in debt to Vane. He needed to destroy the Lord not to help her, but to save himself. Everything. The rescue at the auction, the talk of justice and revenge, the gentle way he'd held Ghost, all of it had been manipulation. Another powerful man using her for his own ends. Elowen, the Duke started. Don't. She cut him off, her voice shaking. Don't say my name. Don't apologize. Just tell me the truth. Did you buy my father's debts to help me, or to help yourself? The Duke's jaw tightened. Both. Both, she repeated numbly. How convenient. It's not like that. Then what is it like? She felt tears burning behind her eyes and hated herself for them. You let me think you were doing this out of loyalty to my father, out of some noble desire for justice. But you're just another player in Vane's game, trying to save your own estate by using me as a pawn. That's not true. The Duke took a step toward her, then stopped when Ghost growled again. Yes, I need to stop Vane to save Oakhaven. Yes, exposing his fraud serves my interests as well as yours. But I also meant every word I said about your father, about the debt I owe him. Both things can be true at once. Can they? Elowen's laugh was bitter. Or is that just what you tell yourself to sleep at night? Mrs. Petra had retreated during Vane's visit, but now she reappeared at the top of the stairs, her face carefully neutral. Shall I prepare Miss Vance's things, Your Grace? For her departure? The question hung in the air between them. The Duke's gray eyes held Elowen's, and she saw genuine pain there, beneath the careful control. "That's Miss Vance's decision," he said quietly. "Not mine." Elowen looked down at Ghost, who had finally stopped growling and was watching her with those dark, knowing eyes. The puppy had trusted the Duke from the first moment, had seen something in him that she was too hurt and angry to see right now. But Ghost had also growled at Vane with pure, instinctive hatred. "Animals have better judgment than humans," the Duke had said. She took a shaky breath. "If I stay, I need the whole truth. No more secrets, no more convenient omissions. Everything." The Duke nodded slowly. "Everything. And I'm not your pawn. If we're doing this, we're partners, equal partners." "Agreed." Elowen turned to Mrs. Petra. "I'll need that ball gown after all, and it should be spectacular. If I'm going to walk into Vane's house and rob him blind, I want to look like I belong there." The housekeeper's lips twitched in what might have been approval. "Very good, miss. I'll send for the dressmaker immediately." The Duke was still watching her, something like relief flickering across his features. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Elowen said coldly. "We still need to find a way to invalidate that service contract before Thursday. And then we need to save your estate, expose Vane's fraud, and somehow find my father, or prove what happened to him. All in 3 days." "Impossible odds," the Duke agreed. "Good." Elowen's smile was sharp as broken glass. "I'm tired of things being easy." The ballroom at Oakhaven had been closed for 6 years, the furniture draped in holland covers and the chandeliers wrapped in muslin to protect them from dust. Mrs. Petra supervised the uncovering with the grim efficiency of someone preparing for battle, which, Elowen supposed, was exactly what they were doing. The Duke stood in the center of the room, looking profoundly uncomfortable in formal evening dress. He'd shed his usual dark, practical clothing for the required tailcoat and white waistcoat, and kept tugging at his collar as though it were strangling him. "Stop that," Elowen said, crossing to him and batting his hand away from his neck. "You'll wrinkle the linen." "I hate these things," he muttered. "They serve no practical purpose except to make breathing difficult. They serve the very practical purpose of signaling to everyone at Vane's ball that you're a man of refinement and taste, not a reclusive eccentric who's forgotten how civilized people behave." She adjusted his cravat, which he'd tied with more attention to efficiency than elegance. "When was the last time you attended a social function?" "My father's funeral, 6 years ago." "And before that?" The Duke's jaw tightened. "My wedding, 7 years ago." Elowen's hands stilled on his cravat. She'd known, vaguely, that the Duke had been married, but Mrs. Petra had deflected her questions with tight-lipped disapproval, and she hadn't pressed. "I didn't know you were widowed. I'm sorry." "Don't be. She's not dead." His voice was flat, emotionless. "She left 3 months after the ceremony, ran off with a cavalry officer to India. The scandal was significant enough that I retreated here and haven't ventured into society since." That explained the locked doors, the empty house, the way he moved through Oakhaven like a ghost haunting his own life. Elowen finished adjusting his cravat and stepped back, studying him. "Then tomorrow night will be your grand reappearance. The Duke of Oakhaven, emerging from exile to attend the social event of the season." "They'll tear me apart," he said matter-of-factly. "The gossips. They've had 6 years to sharpen their tongues on my absence. Only if you give them ammunition." Elowen moved to the side of the room where Mrs. Petra had set up chairs to approximate a crowded ballroom. Ghost was curled up on one of them, watching the proceedings with sleepy interest. The The key to surviving a ball isn't avoiding the gossips, it's controlling the narrative before they can. The Duke looked skeptical. And how exactly do I do that? By being so perfectly composed, so utterly unbothered by their whispers, that they have nothing to work with except admiration for your dignity. She picked up her skirts. She was wearing one of her old day dresses, since the ball gown wouldn't be ready until tomorrow, and demonstrated a curtsy. Social warfare is like any other kind of warfare. You need strategy, timing, and the element of surprise. You sound like your father. The Duke's expression softened slightly. He used to say the same thing about negotiating with creditors. My mother said it about managing the village charitable committee. Elowen smiled despite herself. She said Mrs. Caldwell was more dangerous than Napoleon and had to be outmaneuvered rather than confronted directly. The Duke's mouth quirked. Your mother was a wise woman. She was. Elowen pushed away the ache of grief that always came with thoughts of her mother. Now, let's start with the basics. When you enter the ballroom, everyone will stop and stare. That's inevitable. What do you do? Glare at them until they look away? No. Elowen fought back a laugh. You pause in the doorway just long enough to be noticed. Then you proceed directly to greet your host with perfect courtesy, ignoring the stares as though they're beneath your notice. The Duke practiced the pause, but his version looked more like he was bracing for an attack than making an entrance. Too aggressive, Elowen said. You look like you're about to challenge someone to a duel. Relax your shoulders. Imagine you're simply surveying your own estate, checking that everything is in order. He tried again, and this time it was better. Still intimidating, but with an air of authority rather than hostility. Good. Now, when we greet Lord Vane, you'll need to be cordial without being friendly. Acknowledge him as your host. Thank him for the invitation. I wasn't invited, the Duke interrupted. I plan to simply arrive and dare him to turn me away in front of his guests. Elowen stared at him. That's your plan? Just show up uninvited? Vane won't refuse me entry. It would be too obvious, too much of an insult. He'll let us in because doing otherwise would raise questions he doesn't want asked. The Duke's smile was cold. And once we're inside, we're his guests, entitled to all the usual courtesies. Including the use of the retiring rooms, Elowen said slowly, understanding now, which gives us an excuse to wander the upper floors. Exactly. She had to admit, it was cleverly done. Ruthless, but clever. All right. But that means you need to be absolutely perfect in your manners once we're inside. Any hint of hostility, any suggestion that you're there for reasons other than social pleasure, and Vane will have footmen watching our every move. The Duke sighed. Which means I have to be charming. Devastatingly so. Elowen gestured to the chairs. Let's practice. Mrs. Petra, would you mind playing the role of Lady Ashford? She'll definitely be there, and she's the worst gossip in London. Mrs. Petra's expression suggested she'd rather clean chamber pots, but she moved to one of the chairs and settled into it with regal bearing. I suppose someone must teach His Grace how civilized people behave. Don't enjoy this too much, the Duke muttered. Elowen positioned herself beside him. Remember, Lady Ashford will try to bait you. She'll mention your wife or your long absence, or make some cutting remark about your estate. You need to deflect without engaging. She nodded to Mrs. Petra, who immediately transformed into a caricature of aristocratic disdain. Why, Duke Mordrake, the housekeeper said in a high, affected voice. How surprising to see you among the living. We'd all assumed you died of shame after that unfortunate business with the cavalry officer." The Duke's expression went glacial. "Lady Ashford?" "No," Elowen interrupted. "You can't let her see she's struck a nerve. Try again. Deflect with humor or redirect the conversation entirely." The Duke took a breath, visibly controlling his temper. Mrs. Petra repeated her cutting remark, and this time he managed a thin smile. "Shame is for those who care what others think, Lady Ashford. I've found isolation has its advantages. No tedious small talk, for one." "Better," Elowen said. "But too sharp. You sound bitter. Once more, but this time make it light, as though her opinion is of no consequence whatsoever." They practiced the exchange 3 more times before the Duke managed the right tone, dismissive without being rude, amused rather than wounded. Ghost woke up long enough to yawn his approval, then went back to sleep. "Now the dancing," Elowen said. The Duke looked horrified. "Absolutely not. You'll have to dance at least once, or people will talk. And if we're establishing you as my protector rather than my creditor, it makes sense that you dance with me." "I don't dance." "You mean you don't dance well," Elowen corrected. "There's a difference. Mrs. Petra, could you ask one of the maids to play something on the pianoforte? I heard one in the music room." "This is absurd," the Duke said. But he didn't resist when Elowen took his hand and placed it at her waist. A few minutes later, a waltz drifted in from the music room, played by someone with more enthusiasm than skill. Elowen positioned the Duke's other hand properly and rested her own on his shoulder. "Just follow the basic pattern," she said. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Don't think about it too much." The Duke moved like he was marching into battle, stiff and mechanical. He stepped on her foot twice in the first minute. "Relax," Elowen said, trying not to wince. "You're not subduing an enemy. You're dancing. Feels the same to me." Despite herself, Elowen laughed. "Has anyone ever told you that you take everything too seriously?" "Your father, frequently." The Duke's expression softened slightly, and his movements became less rigid. "He tried to teach me to dance once. Said it was essential for estate management because it taught you how to lead and follow in equal measure." He was right. Elowen guided him through a turn, and this time he didn't stumble. "See? You're getting it." They continued in silence for a few moments, and Elowen became aware of how close they were, how her hand fit naturally against his shoulder, how his grip at her waist was gentle despite his strength. She could smell the cedar and smoke scent that seemed to cling to him, could see the silver threading through his dark hair at his temples. "Why are you doing this?" the Duke asked quietly. "Teaching me, helping me. After what Vane revealed, you have every reason to walk away." Elowen met his eyes. "Because Ghost trusts you, and because I think you meant what you said about owing my father a debt. You're using me, yes, but you're also trying to help me. Both things are true." "I am trying to help you," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten. "Not just because it serves my purposes, but because you deserve justice. Your family deserves justice. Then let's make sure we're ready to take it." Elowen stepped back as the music ended. "Tomorrow night, we walk into that ballroom like we own it. We charm everyone who matters. We slip away when the moment is right, and we find the proof we need to bury Vane so deep he'll never crawl out." The Duke's smile was sharp and dangerous. "And if we're caught?" "Then we improvise." Elowen returned his smile with one of her own. My mother always said the best battle plans survive only until the first shot is fired. After that, it's all courage and quick thinking. Your mother really did have wisdom for every occasion. She had to. She was married to my father. Elowin's voice caught slightly on the words. Before the illness, before everything fell apart, they were the kind of couple who could face anything together. I used to think I'd never find that. The Duke was quiet for a moment, then said, "You will. When this is over, when you're free of Vane and the debts and all of it, you'll have the chance to build whatever life you choose." "And what about you?" Elowen asked. "What will you do when this is over?" He looked around the empty ballroom, at the uncovered chandeliers and the dust motes dancing in the late afternoon light. "I suppose I'll have to decide whether Oakhaven is a home or just a very expensive hiding place." Ghost chose that moment to jump down from his chair and trot over to them, sitting expectantly at the Duke's feet. The message was clear. Less talking, more attention required. The Duke bent down and scratched the puppy's ears, and Elowen saw his expression shift, the careful control dropping away to reveal something vulnerable beneath. "Thank you," he said, still looking at Ghost, "for staying, for trusting me enough to try." "Don't make me regret it," Elowen said softly. "I'll do my best." He straightened, and the Duke of Oakhaven was back in place, armored and ready. "Now, shall we practice the entrance one more time? I want to make sure I can pause in a doorway without looking like I'm about to declare war." "You are about to declare war," Elowen pointed out. His smile was fierce and bright. "Then, I'd better make it a memorable entrance." The morning of the ball dawned gray and ominous, with clouds gathering on the horizon like an approaching army. Elowen stood at her window watching the sky darken, Ghost pressed against her leg in a way that suggested the puppy could sense the storm coming in more ways than one. She'd spent the early hours reviewing her father's journal again, memorizing dates and amounts, preparing for what they might find in Vane's study tonight. The ledger with the forged promissory note lay on her desk, positioned carefully between two heavy books to keep the pages flat. It was their best evidence so far, proof that Vane had manufactured at least some of the debt. A knock at the door pulled her attention away from the window. "Come in." One of the younger maids entered, the same nervous girl who'd brought water her first night. "Begging your pardon, miss, but Mrs. Petra says the dressmaker is here with your gown. She's waiting in the blue parlor." "Thank you. Tell her I'll be down in a moment." The maid bobbed a curtsy and disappeared. Elowen turned back to gather the journal and ledger, planning to lock them in the Duke's study for safekeeping while she was occupied with the dress fitting. She reached for the ledger and froze. The space between the books was empty. Her heart lurched. She checked the floor, thinking it might have fallen, then searched the desk drawers with increasingly frantic movements. The ledger was gone. Ghost barked sharply, his attention fixed on the door. He'd been lying quietly a moment ago, but now his whole body was tense, alert. Elowen ran to the corridor, looking both ways. A flash of movement caught her eye, someone turning the corner toward the servants' stairs, moving quickly. Too quickly. "Stop!" she shouted, gathering her skirts and running after them. She caught a glimpse of dark fabric disappearing down the narrow staircase. The servants' passage was dim and cramped, nothing like the grand staircases meant for family and guests. Elowen took the stairs two at a time, Ghost's claws scrabbling on the wood behind her as he struggled to keep pace. The figure ahead pushed through a door at the bottom, and Elowen burst through after them, emerging into the kitchen. The cook looked up in surprise from her pastry, but Elowen didn't stop to explain. chasing the thief through the scullery and out the back door. Rain had started to fall, cold and hard. The sky had gone nearly black, and wind whipped across the grounds with enough force to steal her breath. Ahead, she could see someone running toward the stables, their cloak billowing behind them. Ghost shot past her, barking furiously, his small white form stark against the darkening landscape. The puppy might be young, but he was fast, and more importantly, he was determined. "Ghost, wait!" But the puppy was already halfway to the stables, and Elowen had no choice but to follow. Thunder rolled overhead as she reached the stable doors. They stood open, swinging in the wind. Inside, horses whinnied nervously, disturbed by the storm. Ghost's barking echoed from somewhere in the back. Elowen stepped inside, her eyes struggling to adjust to the dimness. "I know you're here. Just give back the ledger and we can forget this happened." A sound behind her made her spin around. The Duke's driver stood there, the ledger clutched in his weathered hands. He was an older man, someone she'd barely noticed in her days at Oakhaven, quiet and efficient in his duties. "I can't do that, miss," he said, and there was genuine regret in his voice. "I'm sorry. I truly am." "Vane paid you," Elowen said, understanding clicking into place. "How much? What's he paying you to spy for him?" "Enough to clear my daughter's debts." The driver's jaw tightened. "Lord Vane holds the note on her husband's shop. He said if I kept him informed about his Grace's activities, if I passed along anything useful, he'd forgive it. My grandson is sick. Miss, we need that shop." Ghost appeared from the back of the stable, his barking reaching a fevered pitch. He positioned himself between Elowen and the driver, small body vibrating with protective fury. "So you'll betray the Duke? After everything he's done for you?" "His Grace has been good to me," the driver admitted. "But my family comes first. You'd do the same in my position. I wouldn't help a monster destroy innocent people." Elowen took a step forward. "That ledger proves Vane is a fraud. If you give it to him, he'll destroy it, and we'll lose our only chance to expose what he's done. That's not my concern." The driver moved toward the stable doors, and Ghost lunged forward, teeth bared. "Call off your beast, miss, or I'll—" Thunder cracked overhead, so loud the horses screamed in their stalls. In that moment of distraction, Ghost darted forward and sank his teeth into the driver's trouser leg, pulling with all his small strength. The driver stumbled, and the ledger flew from his hands, pages fluttering as it sailed through the air. Elowen dove for it, her fingers closing around the leather binding, just as it hit the hay-strewn floor. "No!" The driver recovered his balance and lurched toward her. But Ghost was already there, placing himself between them, with a growl that sounded far too large for his small body. Elowen scrambled backward, clutching the ledger to her chest. The driver took another step forward, and Ghost snapped at his ankle, forcing him back. "I'm sorry," Elowen said, meaning it. "I'm sorry about your daughter, about your grandson, but I can't let you do this." The driver's face twisted with anguish. "You don't understand. Vane will ruin us. He'll call in the debt and take everything." "He's going to do that anyway," Elowen said quietly. "That's what he does. He makes promises, gets what he wants, and then destroys you regardless. My father learned that. Don't make the same mistake." Rain pounded on the stable roof now, a deafening roar. The driver looked between Elowen and the ledger, conflict clear on his weathered face. "Miss Vance?" The Duke's voice cut through the storm. He appeared in the stable doorway, taking in the scene with swift assessment. Elowen on the ground clutching the ledger, Ghost standing guard, the driver frozen with guilt written across his features. Thomas, the Duke said, his voice dangerously quiet. What have you done? The driver's shoulders sagged. I'm sorry, Your Grace. Lord Vane, he said. He promised. I know what he promised. The Duke moved into the stable with the controlled grace of a predator. He promised to forgive your daughter's debt if you spied for him. He's been using the same tactic for years. Did he also mention that he bought that debt specifically to have leverage over you? That your daughter's husband was doing fine until Vane orchestrated his bankruptcy? The driver's face went pale. No. He said it was just bad luck, bad business. It's never just bad luck with Vane. The Duke's expression was hard. He identifies targets, manufactures their ruin, then offers salvation in exchange for loyalty. Once he's used you, he'll discard you and call in the debt anyway. Lightning flashed, illuminating the stable in stark white light. Ghost finally relaxed his guard, trotting over to Elowen and pressing against her side. She stroked his wet fur with shaking hands, her heart still racing. I didn't want to betray you, Your Grace, the driver said, his voice breaking. But my grandson is 6 years old and has the consumption, the Duke finished. I know, Thomas. I have known about your situation for months. Why do you think I've been paying for the physician visits? The driver stared at him. That was you? The anonymous benefactor? Was me. The Duke's voice softened slightly. You've served my family for 30 years. Did you really think I wouldn't help when you needed it? Elowen watched something crumble in the driver's expression, shame and relief and bitter regret all mixed together. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry, I thought. I didn't know what else to do. You could have asked me. The Duke moved closer, his anger tempered by understanding. But Vane is skilled at making people feel desperate, at convincing them they have no choices left. That's how he maintains power. Thunder rumbled again, closer now. The storm was directly overhead. Did you tell him about tonight? Elowen asked, still clutching the ledger. About the ball? The driver shook his head. I was supposed to send word after I secured the ledger. He doesn't know you found the forgeries yet. Small mercies. Elowen stood up, her dress soaked and muddy, and faced the Duke. What do we do with him? The Duke studied his driver for a long moment. Thomas, you have a choice. You can continue working for Vane, in which case I'll dismiss you immediately and you'll receive no references. Or you can tell me everything Vane has asked you to report. Help us finish what we've started and trust that I'll handle your daughter's debt when this is over. You'd still help me? After I betrayed you? I'd help you because your family needs it, not because you've earned it. The Duke's voice was firm. But this is your last chance. If you betray us again, I won't be so forgiving. The driver dropped to his knees in the hay, shoulders shaking. Thank you, Your Grace. Thank you. I'll tell you everything, I swear it. Elowen met the Duke's eyes over the kneeling man's head. She saw in them the same quality that had made her father trust him all those years ago. The ability to be both ruthless and merciful, to understand that people were complicated, that desperation made fools of everyone eventually. Ghost barked once, short and satisfied, as if to say the crisis was resolved and could they please get out of the rain now. Come, the Duke said, offering his hand to help the driver stand. We'll talk in my study. Miss Vance needs to change before she catches her death, and we have a ball to prepare for. As they left the stable, rain soaking them all to the skin, Elowen felt the ledger solid and safe against her chest. They'd kept it from Vane's hands, barely. But it had been too close. The Lord was more dangerous than she'd realized, with spies even within Oakhaven's walls. Tonight would be their only chance to turn the tables. If they failed, if Vane discovered what they were planning, there would be no second opportunity. Ghost pressed against her leg as they walked, and she took comfort in his warm presence. The puppy had saved them tonight, his instincts and courage buying them the time they needed. "Good boy," she murmured, scratching behind his ears. "Very good boy." His tail wagged proudly, rainwater flying from his soaked fur, and despite everything, the storm, the betrayal, the danger waiting for them tonight, Elowen smiled. They were still in the fight, and that would have to be enough. The ball gown was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk that seemed to shift between black and deepest sapphire depending on the light. Mrs. Petra had outdone herself, commissioning a design that spoke of elegance and authority rather than girlish innocence. The neckline was modest but striking, the waist perfectly tailored, and the skirts fell in graceful folds that whispered against the floor as Elowen moved. She studied herself in the mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back. Her hair had been swept up by one of the maids, pinned with silver combs that caught the candlelight. She looked like she belonged at a ball in a lord's London mansion. She looked like someone Lord Vane couldn't dismiss as a desperate debtor's daughter. Ghost sat on the bed behind her, his white fur freshly brushed, watching with approval. They debated bringing him to the ball, but ultimately decided it was too risky. He'd have to remain at Oakhaven tonight, though he clearly wasn't pleased about being left behind. A knock at the door made her turn. "Come in?" The Duke entered, and Elowen's breath caught. She'd seen him in formal dress during their practice sessions, but this was different. His evening clothes were perfectly fitted, his cravat tied with the casual expertise she'd drilled into him, and he'd done something to his hair that made him look less like a reclusive scholar and more like the powerful nobleman he actually was. He stopped when he saw her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "You look—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "Formidable." "Good." Elowen picked up her gloves, the fine kid leather smooth beneath her fingers. "That's exactly what I was aiming for. You clean up rather well yourself." His mouth quirked. "High praise from my etiquette instructor. Don't let it go to your head. You still pause too long in doorways." She crossed to him, adjusting his cravat minutely, even though it didn't need it. "Are you ready for this?" "No." His honesty was stark. "But I'm ready to stop hiding. Ready to face them all and show them that Vane doesn't own me." "He doesn't own either of us," Elowen said firmly. "Not anymore. Tonight, we take back everything he's stolen." The Duke's driver, Thomas, now their somewhat reluctant ally, had the carriage waiting. The storm from earlier had passed, leaving the evening cold and crisp, with stars beginning to emerge from behind scattered clouds. They rode in silence for the first part of the journey, both lost in their own thoughts. "Thomas," the Duke said finally, leaning forward to address the driver through the small window. "What should we expect tonight? What has Vane told you about his security?" Thomas's voice came back, tight with anxiety. "He's hired extra footmen, Your Grace, not for service, for watching. He told me he expects someone might try to cause trouble, though he didn't say who. They'll be positioned throughout the house." "How many?" "8 that I know of. Big men, the kind used to handling problems quietly." Elowen and the Duke exchanged glances. 8 guards made searching Vane's study significantly more complicated. "What about the upper floors?" Elowen asked. "Will they be guarded too?" 2 men stationed at the main staircase. But there's a servant's stair at the back of the house, near the conservatory. It's usually unguarded during events because the staff uses it for service. Usually, the Duke repeated. But tonight? Thomas hesitated. I don't know, Your Grace. Lord Vane has been more paranoid than normal these past few days. After the incident at Oakhaven, after he came to collect Miss Vance and you refused, he knows something is wrong. The carriage rolled on through the darkness, carrying them closer to Vane's London residence with every turn of the wheels. Elowen felt her heart beating faster, adrenaline beginning to sharpen her senses. We adapt, she said, echoing what she'd told the Duke during their training. We assess the situation, find the weakness in his defenses, and exploit it. The Duke's hand found hers in the darkness of the carriage, his grip warm and steady. Together, she agreed. Vane's residence appeared ahead, ablaze with light. Carriages lined the street, depositing elegantly dressed guests who streamed through the wide front doors into the entrance hall beyond. Music and laughter drifted out into the night, the sound of London's elite enjoying themselves, oblivious to the drama about to unfold. Their carriage joined the queue, and Elowen felt the Duke tense beside her. Remember what we practiced? She said quietly. Pause, survey, proceed with authority. You belong here just as much as anyone. I belong here more than most of them, he corrected, an edge of steel entering his voice. I'm a duke. Vane is barely a baron. That's the spirit? The carriage finally reached the entrance. A footman opened the door, and the Duke descended first, then turned to offer Elowen his hand. She took it, stepping down onto the cobblestones with her head high and her expression serene. Inside, they could hear the master of ceremonies announcing arrivals. A couple emerged from the entrance hall looking flushed and excited, already gossiping about who was in attendance. They stopped when they saw the Duke, their eyes widening with recognition. Is that? The woman started. Duke Mordrake, her companion confirmed, his voice carrying. Good God, I didn't think he'd show his face in society again after. The Duke's expression didn't change. He simply offered Elowen his arm and proceeded up the steps as though he hadn't heard, moving with the exact pace and bearing they'd practiced. Not too fast, not too slow. A man comfortable in his own power. The entrance hall fell silent as they entered. Conversations died mid-sentence, fans stopped their fluttering, and every eye turned toward them. The master of ceremonies, a portly man with magnificent whiskers, actually stammered when he saw them. His Grace, the Duke of Oakhaven, he finally managed, his voice carrying through the sudden quiet. And Miss Elowen Vance. The pause that followed was electric. Elowen kept her chin level, her hand steady on the Duke's arm, and surveyed the crowd with the same calm assessment she'd seen her mother use 100 times. These people had watched her family fall. Some of them, like Mrs. Caldwell, had taken pleasure in it, but tonight, she wasn't the desperate girl clutching a puppy in the mud. Tonight, she was the Duke of Oakhaven's companion, and that changed everything. Lord Vane appeared at the far end of the hall, pushing through the crowd with barely concealed fury on his face. He'd clearly not expected them to actually attend, certainly not together, and definitely not looking like they owned the place. The Duke executed the pause perfectly, a moment of stillness that let every person in the room get a good look at them, then proceeded forward to greet his host. Lord Vane, he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. Thank you for your hospitality. I hope you don't mind that I brought Miss Vance. She's been staying at Oakhaven as my guest, and I thought it would do her good to rejoin society after her recent difficulties. The brilliance of it struck Elowen immediately. By announcing her presence at Oakhaven publicly, the Duke was making it impossible for Vane to claim she owed him service. How could she be a servant to Vane's mother when she was clearly the Duke's guest? The service contract would look like exactly what it was: a fraudulent attempt to claim ownership of another man's ward. Vane's smile was poisonous. How unexpected. I wasn't aware you'd been issued an invitation, Your Grace. Wasn't I? The Duke's expression was mild, but his eyes were cold as winter's sea. My apologies. I assumed a ball of this magnitude would naturally include all the peers of the realm. Unless you're suggesting my presence isn't welcome? It was a trap, and they both knew it. If Vane said yes, he'd insult a duke in front of half of London's aristocracy. If he said no, he'd have to allow them to stay. Of course you're welcome, Vane said through gritted teeth. Both of you. Please, enjoy the festivities. We intend to. The Duke inclined his head with perfect courtesy, then guided Elowen past their host and into the ballroom beyond. The room was magnificent. Crystal chandeliers, walls hung with silk, and an orchestra playing from a raised platform at the far end. Couples swirled across the dance floor, while others clustered in groups, drinking champagne and trading gossip. And all of them were still staring at the Duke and Elowen. Lady Ashford materialized from the crowd like a shark scenting blood. She was exactly as Mrs. Petra had portrayed her. Elegant, sharp-featured, and radiating malicious curiosity. Duke Mordrake, she purred. What a delicious surprise, and with dear Silas Vance's daughter, no less. Tell me, are congratulations in order? Here it was, the first real test. The Duke's smile was slight but genuine. For what, Lady Ashford? Why, your engagement, of course. Surely that's the only reason a gentleman of your standing would bring an unmarried young lady to a ball. Elowen felt the Duke's arm tense beneath her fingers, but his voice remained perfectly controlled. Miss Vance is under my protection as her late father's student and friend. I'm helping her navigate the recent unfortunate business with Lord Vane's fraudulent debt collection. The word fraudulent dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water. Lady Ashford's eyes widened, and several nearby conversations stopped entirely. Fraudulent? Lady Ashford repeated, her voice rising with glee. My dear Duke, what a serious accusation. One I'm prepared to substantiate. The Duke's gaze swept the room, finding Vane across the ballroom. In fact, I'm here tonight specifically to address certain irregularities in Lord Vane's business practices. Irregularities that have affected not only the Vance family, but several other estates as well. The murmur that rippled through the crowd was exactly what they'd hoped for. Shock, fascination, and the kind of scandalous interest that would keep everyone's attention fixed on them, rather than wondering what they were really doing here. Vane was moving toward them now, his face flushed with barely controlled rage. This should be interesting, Elowen murmured. The Duke's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. Remember, we're not here to fight. We're here to distract, while we rob him blind. Exactly. Lord Vane reached them, his smile sharp as broken glass. Your Grace, perhaps we should discuss your concerns in private. I'd hate for there to be any misunderstanding in front of our guests. Oh, I think our guests would be very interested, the Duke said pleasantly. After all, several of them have also done business with you. I'm sure they'd like to know if their contracts are as creative as the ones you prepared for Silas Vance. The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama. Lady Ashford was practically vibrating with excitement. You're making a scene, Vane hissed. Am I? The Duke looked around as though just noticing the audience. How terribly rude of me. Please don't let us interrupt your lovely ball. Miss Vance and I will simply enjoy the music. Perhaps a dance would be appropriate? He turned to Elowen, and she saw the question in his eyes. This was it. The distraction they needed. While everyone watched them on the dance floor, making a spectacle, they'd have their chance to slip away. "I'd be delighted," Elowen said, loud enough to be heard. The Duke led her onto the floor just as the orchestra struck up a waltz. His hand found her waist, her hand found his shoulder, and they began to move through the steps they'd practiced in the empty ballroom at Oakhaven. Around them, the crowd whispered and stared. But Elowen barely noticed. She was focused on the Duke's face, on the slight nod he gave her, as they turned past the conservatory entrance where the servants' stairs waited. "On the next turn," he murmured. "Ready?" Elowen's heart hammered against her ribs. "Ready?" They swept through the steps, graceful and perfectly timed, and when they reached the edge of the dance floor nearest the conservatory, they simply kept going, through the doors, into the darkness beyond, leaving the whispers and music and Lord Vane's furious face behind them. The hunt had begun. The servants' staircase was narrow and dark, lit only by a single candle in a wall sconce. Elowen gathered her skirts and climbed quickly, the Duke close behind her. Below they could hear raised voices, Vane shouting orders to find them, footsteps rushing through the conservatory. "He knows," Elowen whispered. "Doesn't matter. We just need 5 minutes." The Duke pulled a skeleton key from his waistcoat. "Thomas said Vane's study is the third door on the left." They reached the second-floor landing and moved swiftly down the corridor. The sounds of the ball were muffled here, replaced by an eerie quiet. The Duke found the study door and worked the lock with practiced efficiency that made Elowen wonder where he'd learned such a skill. The door swung open, revealing a room that reeked of expensive cigars and self-importance. Vane's desk dominated the space, its surface clear except for a single lamp. But the walls were lined with filing cabinets and lockboxes. "He's a collector," the Duke murmured, moving to the nearest cabinet. Thomas was right. He keeps everything. Elowen took the opposite wall, pulling open drawers. Files upon files of contracts, promissory notes, property deeds, all meticulously organized by family name. She found the V section and pulled out the Vance folder with trembling hands. Inside were a dozen documents bearing her father's signature. Some she recognized, legitimate debts from before the illness. Others were clearly forged, the handwriting wrong, the dates impossible. And there, at the bottom of the pile, was a physician's report. Her breath caught. "I found it." The proof he knew. The Duke was at her side instantly, reading over her shoulder. The report was dated 2 years ago, written by a Dr. Whitmore, detailing Silas Vance's deteriorating mental condition and recommending immediate family intervention. At the bottom, in Vane's own handwriting, was a note. "Useful. Continue extending credit. He won't remember what he signed." "That bastard," the Duke breathed. "He had a doctor confirm your father's illness, then deliberately exploited it." Footsteps thundered in the corridor outside. They were out of time. Elowen shoved the folder inside her bodice, the papers crackling against the silk. "We need to leave. Now." But the door burst open before they could move, and Lord Vane stood there with 4 of his hired guards, his face twisted with triumph. "How predictable," he said. "Did you really think I'd leave my study unguarded? I've been watching you since you slipped away from the dance floor." He gestured to the guards. "Seize them. We'll deal with this quietly, away from my guests." The guards moved forward, but the Duke stepped between them and Elowen, his voice cutting through the room like steel. "Touch her, and I'll see you all hang for assault on a peer of the realm." The guards hesitated, looking to Vane for direction. "He's bluffing," Vane snapped. "He broke into my home, into my private study. He has no authority here." "Actually," came a new voice from the doorway, "I rather think he does." A tall man in magistrate's robes stepped into the study, followed by 2 constables. He surveyed the scene with cool assessment, his gaze settling on Vane. "Lord Vane, I am Magistrate Blackwood. I'm here regarding several complaints of fraudulent debt collection and exploitation of the mentally infirm." Vane's face went white. "This is absurd. Who filed such complaints?" "I did." The Duke's voice was steady. "Along with affidavits from 3 other families you victimized, and a formal petition from the Lord Chancellor's office requesting an immediate investigation into your business practices." Elowen stared at him. "When did you—" "This morning, while you were being fitted for your gown." The Duke's mouth curved slightly. "Did you think I'd rely entirely on whatever we found tonight? I've been building a case for weeks. The evidence we needed from this room is merely the final piece." Magistrate Blackwood moved to the desk, his constables flanking him. "Lord Vane, you're hereby ordered to surrender all financial records pertaining to the complaints. Any attempt to destroy or conceal documents will be considered obstruction of justice." "You can't do this," Vane snarled. "I have connections. You have nothing," the Duke interrupted. "Your connections won't help you when the Lord Chancellor sees proof that you've been systematically defrauding the nobility, that you targeted sick men and manipulated their families, that you forged documents and bribed witnesses." Elowen pulled the folder from her bodice and handed it to the magistrate. "This contains a physician's report proving Lord Vane knew my father was mentally incompetent, along with forged contracts and altered promissory notes." Magistrate Blackwood scanned the documents, his expression growing darker. "Lord Vane, you are under arrest for fraud, forgery, and exploitation. Constables, secure this room. Nothing is to be removed until we've completed a full inventory." The constables moved forward, and this time Vane's guards stepped aside. Their loyalty, apparently, only extended so far. Vane's eyes burned with hatred as he looked at Elowen. "This isn't over. I still hold the mortgage on Oakhaven. When the Duke defaults, and he will default, I'll take everything. The estate, the title, all of it." "About that," the Duke said pleasantly, "I should mention that several of your former victims were quite interested in purchasing your assets once they learned of your arrest. Your mortgage contracts, for instance. I believe the Ashford family was particularly eager. They've been looking for leverage against you for years." Understanding dawned on Vane's face, followed by pure rage. "You sold my own debts out from under me." "I facilitated their transfer to more ethical holders," the Duke corrected, "who have agreed to renegotiate terms at fair market rates. Oakhaven is safe, Vane, and so is everyone else you've tried to destroy." The constables took Vane by the arms, pulling him toward the door. He struggled, his composure finally shattering. "I'll fight this. I'll tie you up in courts for years. You'll spend every penny you have on solicitors." "Then it's fortunate I have quite a lot of pennies," the Duke said. They watched as Vane was led away, his shouts echoing down the corridor. The music from the ballroom had stopped. No doubt the guests were gathering to witness the scandal, their appetites for gossip finally satisfied beyond their wildest dreams. Magistrate Blackwood turned to Elowen and the Duke. "You'll both need to provide formal statements. Tomorrow will be sufficient. For tonight—" He glanced toward the door, where the murmur of excited voices was growing louder. "I suggest you make your exit before Lady Ashford corners you for details." Wise counsel, the Duke agreed. He offered Elowen his arm. Shall we? They descended the main staircase this time, walking through the crowd of stunned aristocrats like royalty. Lady Ashford did try to intercept them, but the Duke simply smiled and said they'd be delighted to share the full story at her next salon, which seemed to satisfy her. Thomas had the carriage waiting, and they climbed inside as the first whispers of fraud and arrest rippled through Vane's guests. The ball was well and truly ruined, but somehow Elowen didn't think anyone would complain. They'd dine out on this scandal for months. The carriage rolled away into the night, and Elowen finally allowed herself to breathe. We did it. You did it, the Duke corrected. Finding that journal, chasing down the ledger, none of this would have been possible without you. Ghost found the journal, Elowen reminded him. And you're the one who built the case, who brought the magistrate, who thought 10 steps ahead of Vane. Then we did it together. The Duke's hand found hers in the darkness. As partners. They rode in companionable silence for a while, exhaustion and relief washing over them both. It was only when they were halfway back to Oakhaven that the Duke spoke again. There's something I need to tell you, about the debt, about your father's estate. Elowen tensed. What about it? I'm forgiving it, all of it. The paperwork will be filed tomorrow, the Vance family debts are cleared in full, and the estate will be returned to you and your siblings. She stared at him. You're giving back my home? It was never really mine. I only held it to keep it from Vane. The Duke's voice was quiet. You're free, Elowen. Free of debt, free of obligation, free to go wherever you choose. The words should have filled her with joy. Instead, they felt like a loss. And what about you? What will you do? Return to Oakhaven, I suppose. Try to figure out what comes next. He looked out the window at the passing darkness. It's been so long since I've had to think about the future. I'm not sure I remember how. You could start by not being alone, Elowen said softly. You could let people in. Let yourself live instead of just existing. The Duke turned to her, and in the dim light from the carriage lamps, she saw vulnerability in his expression. Is that what you'd want? If you stayed? Stayed at Oakhaven? Stayed with me. His hand tightened on hers. Not as a guest, not as someone I'm protecting from creditors. As... He stopped, seeming to struggle for words. As what? Elowen's heart was racing. As someone I care for. Someone I want in my life, not because I owe her father a debt, but because she's brave and clever and sees through all my carefully constructed walls. The Duke's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Because when she's not there, Oakhaven feels empty in a way it never did before. Elowen thought of the Rose Room, of Ghost sleeping in the Duke's study, of waltzing in an empty ballroom while learning to trust again. She thought of how it felt to have a partner, to face the darkness with someone beside her instead of alone. I'll stay, she said. Not because I have to, because I choose to. The Duke's smile was like sunrise breaking over winter landscape, warm and real and completely unguarded. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her gloved knuckles. Then welcome home, he murmured. When they arrived at Oakhaven, Ghost was waiting in the entrance hall, having apparently convinced Mrs. Petra to let him out of the Rose Room. He launched himself at them with such enthusiasm that Elowen nearly fell over, laughing as the puppy licked her face and wagged his entire body with joy. The Duke knelt down to scratch Ghost's ears, and the puppy immediately tried to climb into his lap, white fur against dark evening clothes. I suppose this means he's staying too, the Duke said, but his tone was fond. Did you ever really think he'd leave? Elowen asked. No. The Duke looked up at her, Ghost cradled in his arms. He knew where he belonged from the first moment. Took me a bit longer to figure it out. Mrs. Petra appeared with her usual impeccable timing. Took one look at them, disheveled, exhausted, and grinning like fools, and allowed herself the smallest smile. "Welcome home, miss," she said to Elowen. "I've prepared the East Wing bedroom." The Rose Room seemed a bit temporary for permanent residence. "Permanent," Elowen repeated, testing the word. It felt right. "Very permanent," the Duke agreed, standing with Ghost still in his arms. "If that's acceptable to you." Elowen looked around at Oakhaven, no longer a golden cage or a hiding place, but a home. Her home. Their home. "More than acceptable," she said. "Perfect." Ghost barked his agreement, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled. Not a threat this time, but a promise of rain to wash everything clean and let new things grow. My lovely family, you just watched the journey of Elowen, Ghost and Cillian. You watched Elowen go from losing everything to finding home. Comment one word that describes how this story made you feel. Angry, hopeful, satisfied? I want to know. And if you've ever felt powerless like Elowen, type yes in the comments. You're not alone. Also, I am here asking for 30 seconds of your time. Subscribe so you get the next story. Like this video so others can find it. If you enjoyed Elowen's journey but don't share this video, you're basically saying other people don't deserve to find stories that make them feel something. Don't be that person. Share this with one writing group, one book club, one friend who loves redemption arcs. That's all I ask. You've already given me an hour. Give me 30 more seconds. Your future self and Elowen will thank you. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team.